we clearly don't know the numbers here, 90,000, 137,000, 180,000, but tens of thousands, it appears. Right. Why do we have so many in this country?
Well, I think there's a whole load of issues going on. So I toured yesterday, I went to Templemore, I went to Thurles, Cashel and Clonmel. And all of these towns in their city centres and in their centres have vacant properties over shops or derelict shops. And that has to do with a whole load of economical circumstances to date. But we need to address this issue because there's a huge resource, particularly when we talk about sustainability. Unfortunately, I've had a look at today's report and it doesn't go far enough. And in fact, it's not going to assist people who own buildings because of the cost of renovation.
Yeah, because the condition of these properties, as we said, we're not quite sure how many of these are turnkey. We presume very few of them.
Correct.
And are a lot of them beyond saving? Would they need to be demolished and rebuilt?
No, not at all. Particularly if you go, I'll take Templemore, sorry to Templemore, but I just thought it was such a treat of a town and deserves better. But so many of the properties on the first floor are vacant. But all those properties need to be rewired, replumbed, brought up to Part L in terms of energy, of the building regulations, put in fire certs, make them fire compliant. And by the time you've done all that, the actual funds that are available in terms of grant are wholly inadequate to do up these properties.
Yeah, and yet, Stephen Matthews, Minister Darragh O'Brien, the Minister for Housing, confirmed yesterday, I think he was speaking to News Talk, that this vacant property tax will be introduced in the next budget. So two problems, one of which is we have no idea the scale to start with. And second of all, it's just too expensive for a lot of people to put these properties back on the market.
Yeah, let's address those two concerns then. So it's all about gathering the data, and that's one of the primary recommendations in the report. We have a whole lot of data sets out there. We have a whole lot of organisations collecting data. We have data returns from the LPT returns that are going to be due in. We've recently had a census, so we'd expect the returns back in from that with the old census data. We have websites such as vacanthomes.ie where members of the public can report vacant properties. We've work being done by the Heritage Council in the town centre health checks. So we've all these different data sets out there, and it's important to pull it all together. We recommend a dedicated unit within the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage to concentrate solely on vacancy and dereliction. So we pull all that data together and we've got that good data set. If you can't measure something, you can't manage it. And that's key here. Whether the figures are 137,000 or 90,000, if we look at a comparable vacant homes tax like what was introduced in Vancouver in Canada, it freed up about 26% of that vacant property. So even if we were to take the lowest figure of 90,000 and be very conservative on our figures on it, and we were to free up 25% of that, similar to Vancouver, that's still a substantial amount of property we will bring on stream, providing homes and housing for people much needed. The costs Hugh referred to...
What happened to the 75% then that weren't made available?
I don't know what happened to that. But I mean, if we could bring in 25% of them, I think that would be key. Instead of leaving them idle.
Were they just taxed? The 75% is left taxed?
I presume if you're wealthy enough to pay a tax and keep your home vacant, your home remains vacant. So,
well, I don't think it's about having enough money to pay the tax. The actual issue is I don't have enough money to refurbish the property, but you're going to tax me. And I don't think that's correct, Stephen. I think we have to have a balanced approach here.
You're quite correct.
And we don't have a reasonable approach. But today, if you rewire a house, it's 25,000. To put in plumbing is 25,000. I have to insulate the house. I have to fix the roof, put in new windows. And there's my bill of 150,000, of which I have the luxury to pay the government 13.5% in VAT. Which I think is...
As you do with building any house, you have to put plumbing and electric into it.
There should be no VAT. I think there should be no VAT for first-time buyers or for people doing construction to actually develop homes.
The cost involved in bringing and refurbishing properties back can be prohibitive for people who want to develop those second and third stories. We have a very onerous and difficult regulatory process there. There's about 3 or 4 certificates you have to go through in fire cert, accessibility cert. We've brought in planning exemptions on it as well, but you've also then got to have the self-certification. So it is quite expensive when you're looking at those smaller ones.
OK, so let's just look at the tax for a second, OK, before we talk about how people might be able to avoid that tax, which is obviously bringing the property back onto the market. Rebecca, the Labour Party has been in favour of this tax for some time. put a figure on it.
Well, what they did in Vancouver, they started at 1%, then they went up to 3%, and I think next year it's going to 5%, which, as Stephen says, it brought about 25% of properties back into use. Sometimes people have properties or have land that are there and lying vacant. They can't afford to do them up. But in that case, you should be able to put them on the market to sell them for somebody else who can do it and bring it back into use as a home. There is no excuse for vacancy and dereliction in our towns and cities. And
so just to be clear, are you advocating then 1% this year, 3% next year, 5% the year after?
We didn't put a specific figure on it. What I'm saying is...
Why not? Is that not very important?
From other examples of other countries that have done this, what they had is they had a rolling tax. So they had 1%, they had 5% or 3%, and then they go up to 5%. With the vacant sites levy and with the proposed owned land tax, that's going to be the same. It's going to be going upwards as years go on. But I think it's important to say dereliction is both about homes and bringing homes back into use, but it's also about our towns and cities. And what we're seeing is dereliction sucking the life out of our towns and cities. And areas like, for example, the northwest of the country is particularly affected by dereliction. But it's also particularly affected by lack of rental properties that are there. And in the middle of a housing crisis, there is no excuse for leaving residential properties that could be
No excuse whatsoever. So are you saying no exemptions to this?
No, of course there will be exemptions. But if you can bring something back into use, it should be brought back into use.
OK, just be clear, what are those exemptions? Because there will be people watching this evening who have a property, perhaps have an elderly relative who's in, nursing care, or have a property that they're hoping to be able to renovate in a couple of years and perhaps uses their pension. Are they the properties that should be exempted?
Yeah, the report is clear in that for exemptions for where, for example, there's issues of probate or where there's issues of people who are in fair deal. This is where properties are left vacant for a very, very long time and nobody is bringing them back into use.
Just to be clear,
somebody owns them. They could be used as a home for somebody else, but they are there and they're left vacant. And we see them around this country all over.
OK, but again, we have no idea why those properties are being left vacant. And is there any sort of plan within the plan that was published today to find out why people have left these houses vacant?
That was one of the key recommendations.
Again, it's about the data gathering as well, to know, to have a score condition on buildings out there as well. We have a derelict sites register as well. We need to bring that information about vacancy as well. The condition of that, is it habitable? Does it need small amounts of work? Is it absolutely derelict and uninhabitable?
Okay,
but the reasonable exemptions, and I'm glad you brought that up, because there has to be reasonable exemptions on this. So if it's a holiday home, I would say that's a reasonable exemption. If it's somebody in care, I would say that's a reasonable exemption. If it's your primary residence and you're working abroad for large periods of the year, that's a reasonable exemption. So I think we need to tease those out. But again, it's not, if you take this figure of 137,000 and say, you won't get them all, throw out that idea. That's ridiculous.
I'm just conscious, Stephen, that we already have a vacant site levy in this country that was introduced in 2016.
A complete failure. So full of loopholes, so full of opportunities to appeal it at every stage. There's 21 million euro in vacant site levies. There's only about 1% of it has been collected.
Well, why hasn't it been collected? Why doesn't the government suggest that we look at that first?
So the vacant sites levy also applies to sites, whereas what we're talking about is a vacant property tax, and this is to bring some homes back into use. So they're two separate things. One, local authorities...
But it's the same principle. It is the same principle. You're putting a tax or a levy on something that is vacant, whatever we define as vacant. And I'm saying that the vacant levy has not worked. So why do you believe this works?
Derelict sites levy hasn't worked. Vacant sites levy hasn't worked. It hasn't been applied properly. It hasn't been collected. 21 million in vacant site levies, 1% collected. 5.5
Whose fault is that then,
5.5 million in derelict sites levy and 378,000 collected by the local authorities. We would propose to change those to taxes and have revenue deal with it. So have the local authorities, I know there's gathering the data, and have revenue apply that taxation. That, to me, makes a more reasonable and sensible way to approach that.
About the sort of the carrot and the stick here, because we clearly have the stick, which is the tax. What's the carrot that needs to be there?
Well, the carrot is we need to have the Living City initiative was rolled out in 2015, which was a brilliant scheme where if you worked on your house, you had a rebate of all the money you spent over a 10-year period. And that should be initiated throughout the country, in every town and village. But that, in fact, failed. And in Cork, over the past 7 years, there's been 42 properties. That's all have been completed under the scheme. And that's because of bureaucracy, paperwork, trying to shove building control legislation and regulations for new build into old property which is more than 200 years old. And I think when you talk about, was it Toronto? Vancouver. Yeah. So you have to look at Vancouver and you have to look at the age of the properties in Vancouver and the age of the properties in Ireland. And in Ireland, they're substantially older and therefore require more funds to renovate them.
OK. Killian, was there any discussion today about those funds, about those grants that might be made available to people to, get their properties into a state where they might be able to use them or rent to them or bring them back onto the market?
Yeah, and I think that's what the report recommended as well, was getting to a stage where you could, with a better awareness for what is out there. Hugh there recommend the Living Cities initiative been expanded. There's also the repair and lease scheme, which people can go to their local authorities and say, I have this property, I'm willing to lease it back to the council if there is money there to repair it, and then they would retain ownership of it and actually turn it into an asset that is producing money for them. And so there was limited talk today about what, and in the report about what could be done for the owners. I think though we are seeing probably to a stage where the report acknowledges there's certain digits that will have to be given to help people incentivize to get these homes back into use. But the vacancy and dereliction issue has gone so far out of control in Ireland. Like, some of these properties are vacant 15, 20 years, some in the city centre of Dublin. I think there is recognition that it's unacceptable that some of the property owners, regardless of the problems they've had, have fallen into this issue, because there's no problem with selling property in a city centre at the moment. So anyone who has no money to do up a property should have no problem selling it.
And that is the nub of it.
There's absolutely no.
You have to have the money to be able to do up that property.
And that's where lack of sympathy will probably come from for property owners at the moment, is that there's just no excuse for not selling and flipping and selling on the site if you cannot do something with it.
Do you agree with Killian there? Look, there's no excuse for having a property. If you can't afford to do it up, you should be made to sell it. Do you agree with that principle?
It's not in public interest to have a building vacant and empty during a housing crisis. We need to bring every bit of stock back in to use. We need to encourage people, we need to incentivise them, or we need to use the stick, which will be the tax as well. And you sell it.
Just very quickly, we talked about the repair and lease scheme there. It's up to 60,000, I think, is available in that
60,000. We recommend increasing that in line with inflationary costs as well in the report.
And did you put any upper limit on that?
No, we didn't, because these are all recommendations for the department and others to consider. So we brought in expertise. This is we looked at. We didn't put exact figures on it as well. The Croí Town and Village Fund as well, that's going to be bringing in a grant system for people who wish to purchase an older property and do it up as well. I don't have the exact figures on that. But, there's a number of measures need to be taken here. But we definitely need to address the amount of dereliction and vacancy during the housing crisis.